Like, I mean, I'm a child of the eighties where the whole putting labels on music came out. And let me tell you, whenever a parental advisory label went on a CD, everybody wanted to hear that CD. You're just gravitating kids towards something that they may not have had any interest in reading in the first place, but now it's got that label on it. So you're gonna have those kids who are just gravitating to it for that reason alone.
How would they even know?
If it's in the description, if you're putting that there, they're gonna see that. The description's for everybody, not just for parents, so.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of the description not matching what you see as the content is a very, you know, as you say, a subjective kind of assessment. And I think the disconnect comes from looking at content of some of these books out of context. I was not at the last policy meeting, but there was a book there discussed, Horace and Craig by Margaret Atwood, and some of the items from that book, there was some description from a website listing quotes from the book. And as I'm going through seeing those quotes taken out of context, I had to go back and say, you know, did I actually read this book? Which I did. I read it a couple of years ago. Seeing these quotes pulled out of context really made me wonder, is this the same book that I read? How can this possibly be the same book that I read? Going back and seeing that stuff in context, yeah, all that stuff is there, but it comes out very differently when you pull things out one by one, rather than seeing it in the full context. So, you know, whether the description matches the content, I think that's a judgment call. I think that's a matter of opinion.
I tend to think with this being a push policy from the parents' point of view, they're not going to be limited to just the library's description and destiny when they're deciding which resources they want to restrict from their children. They have the full ability to do research using the internet on their own to figure out which books that they would want to limit their child from. And while I would love that we could be the provider of all information, totally inclusive and 100% accurate, we're not in the position to do that for every title in the library or even titles that would be added. Being that this is an administrative regulation with a parental push, I think we're good with leaving it there. If a parent's going to feel that strongly that this particular book is an issue, they're already going to have some background knowledge of why this is. And so I don't think the school needs to take on an additional responsibility to, you know, provide cliff notes for every resource that's out there.
If I can chime in on related to what Jay said. I know as an English teacher from our conversations on this topic, and one thing I'm going to try to do differently. I already do a lot to empower my students to make judgment calls while they're reading the book. If they get into a book they aren't enjoying or they don't see a connection with, I certainly encourage them to abandon that book, find a new one, because there's good books out there for you. But in terms of prepping them before they find the book, when they just have it in their hands and they're trying to decide, is this for me? I'm going to do more to encourage them to go on the internet, find out what's out there about it. Obviously, try not to spoil it for themselves, but just to get a sense of what people might be saying about that book that maybe goes beyond the description on the jacket. Just to encourage them to again make their decisions for themselves, make informed decisions for themselves based on information that's out there. And I would speak with you also, district admin, just to see if that's something you want me to push to the department as well. But I think that's something to empower the students to be part of the process, be part of their process.
I think that's important that students have a say in what they read. You know, I don't think we should tell kids what to do and what not to do, because what they interest me in may not interest someone else, but I think that student voice, that student choice is so important. We have to trust that our children are going to read things that they're interested in. They're going to read things that are going to help them become more critical thinkers, and not naturally assume that what's in a book is going to impact a student to the point that it's going to turn them from being who their parents raised them to be to something else that they saw in the book. So we have to trust our young people that we're putting the right things in them and that they can make those choices in their own to read the things that interest them and understand what's in a book. You know, understanding the context of the book and the story that they're reading. So I totally agree with that student choice and voice in that is extremely important.
Any other comments on 109?
One other thing, yeah, I don't know what the answer to this is. Our IT policy for what we're blocking and what we're allowing, is it in orchestrated with what the books are?
No.
And we have conflict.
And we have another conflict because we're supposed to be part of Access PA, and Access PA has different descriptions. We're going around talking political stuff and how kids are smart, we want them to do things. We have books in our schools that we don't give accurate descriptions. We're part of Access PA. The Access PA description on all the books that I've submitted, 109 reevaluation forms are totally different than Destiny's. That's a problem. State legislature says we're supposed to be part of Access PA. Access PA for Front Home talks specifically about what's in the book. Destiny does not, as a case example. We're not providing our students with the knowledge of the book they're about to read. They have to read it to find out what's in it. So reading something to find out what's in it is unacceptable. We need to be able to provide that. We have to figure out what we're doing from a standpoint of some of the books that are getting into our school districts don't meet the values. And I've talked about this ad nauseum, and I don't want to rehash it. They don't meet the values of what 109 is about. My issue specifically with the school library bill of rights, it's contradictory because in the ALA, part of the bill of rights talks about weeding and deselection, but the actual bill of rights, just that one portion that's in our policy, talks about being anti-weeding and deselection. So you can't have a policy and an AR that don't match each other. You either have a weeding and deselection policy that's part of the ALA and the library bill of rights, which says weeding and deselection is no good. You have to figure out, what do we want to do as a school district? Do we want to give accurate descriptions of what's in our books? Do we want to legally weed and deselect books based on a criteria that the state legislature said should be part of school board policy? Or do we want to leave everything as it is right now? And then you'll see a flood of 109s get filled out by parents.
Mr. Saylor, if Mrs. Smith and I can double check the reading language in the American Library Association Bill of Rights, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that either one of us was aware there is that contradiction that you just cited, so I'd like to explore that further, and I can certainly report back. Our librarians read the libraries occasionally. They go through, they inventory the books, they also read the collection on occasion, so I'd like to follow up with the committee if I can, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. You want to field trips? You on the Zoom? You're right here.
So this policy is being brought back to have a conversation regarding what we believe are expenses that the district should incur versus what are expenses that we pass on to our families. Typically for a field trip, as a parent, you receive a permission form, you also receive an amount that you need to pay. That is usually constituted based upon any admission fee to wherever the family or the trip might be going. Transportation costs are included in that, as well as if there happens to be a need for a substitute or a nurse substitute to go on. All those costs go into when they submit for the field trip. That is divided then by the number of students attending. Sometimes home and schools also contribute. Sometimes they'll give a flat amount towards a field trip. Sometimes might be district, budgets, for example, if it's something like a debate team or a club that raises money and has money in their account. So I think we're looking to bring a little bit more clarity to the policy itself. Where it says under the authority, number 2 says, the board shall approve field trips in which a financial obligation beyond the typical substitute and ancillary staffing cost is incurred by the district. So that tells us what we need to bring to the board to approve, but it's not as clear as meaning who pays for it. So we've had conversations about curricular trips. And should, like, the second grade trip to Da Vinci, if it's a truly a curricular trip, should we be assuming the cost of transportation admission as a district? Or are we comfortable with what we are passing on to our families? So that's really what we wanted to open up conversation here. I can share that. I'm looking at the right thing. I assumed one of your questions would be, well, how much would that be? So I tried to give you like an example. For first grade, they visit the zoo. So I have, the admission, I have the round trip in terms of the miles, the labor rate for the transportation, the nurse cost, the substitute cost, all of that for one grade level's trip is estimated at $6,800. Then, for example, we could get all the way to Philadelphia, which is where 5th grade goes. That's around $4,000 because the admission cost is very small. Adventure Aquarium in 7th grade this coming year would be around $9,000. So it gives you kind of an idea of a ballpark per grade level field trip if we were to cover admission, transportation, nurse, and substitutes, if there are any needed. So just looking for some conversation as to.
The school associations help fundraise for those events.
Some do, some more than others. So it really is dependent upon the school and what their home and school has been able to contribute, which then does lead to some inequity across the buildings. Skip back trip might cost $10 per student, and another school building, it might cost $15 per student, depending if the home and school contributed in one and not in the other.
What is the cost year over year for like for field trips taken? Do you have an idea of that?
I can
Like it's
look.
like 50,000 or?
I think Mr. Weaver has
varies.
presented that in the past.
Yeah, I remember seeing a number about it, but I know that there is a lot of inequity between the buildings as to what the home and schools contribute, because not all home and schools have the same cash flow.
Is that a nice way of saying some work harder than the others?
No, that's not a nice way of saying it. It's demographically, some home schools are more affluent than others just because of the demographics of the buildings. So I don't think it has anything to do with how hard they work. I think they're all invested in their students.
But and to add on to that, they make different choices as to
How the money is spent.
They were, at least when I was on homeschool, Schwingerville covered busing for all field trips. Skip Back did not.
Because maybe the parents would be able to handle it, but then Skip Back maybe makes a choice to provide things for classroom tasks for teachers and things like that, correct? But regardless, the buildings take care of the kids that have a financial need. That's the standard?
That is
regardless.
correct. That is correct.
And the district does not reimburse the buildings for that, correct?
No,
Okay.
no.
So I just wonder if the district would take on the cost for field trips, like for everyone, how that would impact that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can we back? So when there is a financial need of a student, there's not a district fund that comes out of it, comes out of the building fund for that particular school.
I believe it comes out of their in and out fund, their student count.
That's
Sometimes home and schools, I know East, they'll reach out to us home and school and say, and the home and school there.
yeah, I think we need to do better.
So here's one thing, and I'm not sure if this is what you're thinking, but some feedback from administrators on our team who have come from different districts. If students are attending a field trip, that's a learning experience, it's aligned to the curriculum, and not all of our field trips are, some of them are celebratory in nature. But if they attend a field trip that's aligned to the curriculum, they go to the zoo because they're learning about animals. That's classroom instruction, that's a day of learning, and the district covers it. That's the theory of action in those districts. That's different from the way that we have operated. Now, if eighth grade's going to, go-karts, yeah, or Hershey Park, celebrating the end of middle school, that would be different.
Usually
it-
home and school for something like celebratory, I think home and school would kick in more for that.
Maybe they do.
Traditionally,
Yeah,
Well, I mean, right, the West students pay for that is different than. the East
right,
students pay
okay,
for
that's a
that.
fair point, right?
so another challenge. But in terms of the learning experiences, which for our elementary age students, they take, right now, it used to be two, they take one field trip a year. Middle school is planning on the same, one trip a year. And these trips are aligned to their curricula, to their learning experiences when they're in the classroom.
So then what about things like, music in the parks?
So that's extracurricular. So that wouldn't fall into the same, it wouldn't fall into this category where the district would feel obligated to pay for that, because it's not necessarily, instead of sitting at your desk today, we're gonna go to the Elmwood Zoo, you know, that kind of thing, and learn about some of the content that is otherwise in the standards or the standards aligned curriculum. Just another way of looking at it.
But
that
the
we
district
haven't.
does pay for some of the athletic trips.
We also pay for transportation for some of the music trips, so it's not, you know, it's not one or the other, or only one or the other.
Right.
You know, we can really delineate and see what that balance or that percentage of each looks like, but I think that came out in one of our conversations at the board
Yeah, I
level.
remember that.
You know, we did learn about that. Extracurriculars right now would be different for me in this conversation, if we just think about those curricular trips. What does the committee think about that?
This is, I just have a question, because I mean, we're talking about like kindergarten through eighth grade, but there are field trips at the high school level too. I don't want to see those go away because, oh, now we're doing it this way for K grade. Like, so how would, I mean, perfect example, the Black History class is going to the museum down in
Right,
DC, which, yeah, I actually I get to go. And I just don't want to see like that goes away because now we're not approving that, you know what I mean? Like, so, because it's a smaller group, it's only the kids taking that class that's open to, like, how would that work? With
Those would be considered curricular trips if they're part of a course, like I even have Wallace Island down here is something that our AP environmental science and AP biology goes on. That's only 21 students is what went this past year, but the cost was $10,800.
Yeah.
So we would need to discern what's curricular, what's not, if we're going in this direction.
I wonder if there's data then on districts that have gone that route to make it tied to curriculum. And then eventually that had to make trade-off decisions to say, you know, we just don't have the budget, so we're only gonna do 5 trips. But before they converted or transitioned to that, and it was more, you know, subsidized with parent funding or whomever's helping to fund these, they were doing more trips. And once they changed over to say, we're only gonna do these when we're funding them as part of curriculum, it actually reduced the number of opportunities. I'm not saying that that's true, but I certainly wonder that way we're talking about this, is there any data that would show that that's a consequence of that type of approach, especially if we hit, you know, years or cycles where there's austerity and we wouldn't have the money for those, whereas in the past, these trips were going on, they were scheduled, parents were contributing a certain amount, planning for that. And of course, we're always helping where, you know, there's a challenge and people can't pay for it financially, but where most parents can pay for it, and that's the method that's going on today, is there data that would say what happens when the school takes it over?
We could certainly look into that more. And again, this is just one idea that came from a fellow administrator, one approach. Another approach could be that maybe the district only covers transportation for field trips. And the rest of whatever those field trips cost is something that families end up incurring, or maybe home and schools would be willing to contribute to, I don't know. There are different ways we could look at it. I just wanted to give you some ideas of what some others, you know, have shared and see what your thoughts are as a group.
So I'm thinking that once you get to the high school, you have a much more narrow group of students who are participating in activities. For example, the Wallace Island trip, which I'm, it's my understanding that that is a fabulous experience for students, yet you're spending $10,000 for 21 students, I think. It was.
Right.
So that,
21,000, right?
10,800 for 21 students.
10,000.
so, I mean, that's a question to me when students who, have financial challenges might have a $10 barrier that they are feeling, to participating in an elementary trip. I don't know, if maybe more money needs to be allocated to this one aspect of the budget so that we can support students. But I do think trips at the high school level are a different animal than those at the elementary or middle school level. So the music in the parks, I believe those are like the middle school trips to Hershey, where they go to Hershey. For example, if you're in band and the band goes to Hershey and they do a performance in the park. So in some ways that really is tied to the music that they've been rehearsing and practicing throughout. I mean, but then the corollary of that is then when you get to high school and then they're going to Boston and that's $1,000 trip. And they're also going to be playing music that they've been rehearsing and participating in. So, again, I think you just have a whole different experience and level of expense with some of these high school trips than you do with the elementary and middle. I mean, as a parent of a high school student, I would like to see everybody in elementary and middle school be able to participate in anything that's happening during the school day as part of our curriculum. And then once you're in the high school, and if you choose to opt into some of these more expensive activities, then that's, or more expensive programs, that's something, but then that begs the question of, okay, well, let's say you're enrolled in a class that's going to DC and you want to be a part of that experience. How does that work? And then.
And I think too that you don't want to reduce the opportunities simply because the money's not in the budget, if parents are willing, like I said, this trip to DC was the most expensive field trip. I mean, it was only $63 per person, but it was much more expensive than anything when my kids were in elementary school, where you were looking at 10, 12, I think maybe 20 was the most expensive. But at the same time, like, I don't want any of those kids who are taking that course to miss out because it was $63 and they didn't have it. But it does get more expensive when you're going, I mean, a trip to DC, you can't just take a school bus, like, trust me, you can't get chaperones to take a school bus to DC. It's a longer trip. You're going to Boston, it's a longer trip. It's not just, hey, we're on a bus for 45 minutes. It's a much different beast. But I also don't want to see those opportunities go away at the high school level, because now we're saying it's not in the budget, and so it's out.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe even just a shared cost of some sort, where we say the district gives X amount towards every field trip, whether it's we cover the transportation, but now you're running into the problem of, at the elementary level, that transportation is a school bus, which is a very different than a coach bus.
Right. So just to make another point about the high school, at least it used to be the case, I would need to verify it for this year. Wallops Island students can raise money. They fundraise to offset the cost of their trip too. At least that's what they used to do. I'm not sure if Mr. Marsh and Mr. Clellan might know that for this year.
That's true. I believe that's true.
They continue to sell some things and then they raise money to offset the costs, and they do incur a big part of it at the high school, and it's different.
So I've been making this suggestion for years that on our permission forms, there needs to be a checkbox that says, I need financial assistance with this trip. It should not be on the parent to reach out to the counselor or to the teacher to make that. It should be a check form, and the social worker or whomever should reach out to that parent. We have organizations in this district that are willing to pay for these things. So there, I have certain counselors or teachers that are more involved with Power Packs, that when they have an issue like this, they reach out directly to me. And we try to get that information out to everyone Our social workers are certainly aware of it, so if these forms, if there was a checkbox and it went immediately to the social worker, if there was a student who had a financial issue, they should never miss out on something because of that. So there are funds either through Power Pack or through the foundation to get every kid where they need to go.
Well, that's certainly an easy enough change that we can make.
I
And I
think
don't,
that's important because a lot of parents don't know what's available to them.
yeah.
I mean, they just don't know what they don't know.
Right, right.
And they're embarrassed to reach out, so they're not gonna pick up the phone and make the call, but if there's just a checkbox on there that says, please reach out to me about financial assistance.
And even if they don't want to click the checkbox, at least then they know, oh, I can reach out to the counselor. You know, I mean, if it's something that basically, because some people may say, I don't want somebody to see that I can check off that box or whatever, but it's putting it on there that it's very clear. There is an avenue that no kid, we don't want any kid to miss out on the educational opportunities simply because of a financial hardship.
Excuse me. I'm hearing a couple of points. And I think we're moving in a circle here instead of addressing each one of them. One of them, what I heard, correct me if I'm wrong, is should the district pay for the cost of the trip? And then we're talking about financial encumbrances, which is a different situation. At the high school level, it's different. Because not all students are in these classes. Therefore, for the district to pay the cost of it would be wrong because the students who cannot be in those classes for whatever the reason miss out the opportunity. Now, if in fact you're going to a field trip and it's a specific 20 students and some of them financially can't make it, the ones that financially can't make it, that's a separate subject. But the district should not pay as a blanket policy for 20 students when there's 200 other students who are in different classes that don't get the opportunity to go on the field trip.
Do you
I
think
think
that will
that's a difficult thing then, because you also have sports where the district pays.
We're not talking about sports, we're talking about field trips.
But
We're
you're
talking about paying
you're
for
saying that-
services for the kids
that,
too.
that there may be kids that can't participate for a
Our
certain
discussion
reason.
is on field trips. It's not on sports, it's on field trips.
Right, but you're gonna set a precedent. Once you set one policy, you set precedent on other policies, so I don't, you can't. You have to look at the bigger picture. Sometimes the forest is more important than each individual tree.
But historically, the district has also paid overnight trips, for example, the wrestling team to go on an overnight trip and
But
they.
past practice does not make it correct.
Well, exactly, but I think that is part of the greater issue is not just the curricular trips, but then our co-curriculars and how are those funded? For example, you know, why does the
If we look at Mr. Weaver's last presentation, we have a $4 million problem. We can't just keep spending money.
So Mr. Weaver is very conservative in his budget and.
Well, I'm sorry, maybe it's 3.8. I'm sorry.
No, but you will
Okay.
see a very different budget. Having gone through the budget process with Mr. Weaver. That number is gonna shift
The
around.
problem is we don't have unlimited funds.
Well, absolutely, and I
Well,
think the
now
issue.
you're
is
talking about a
around
separate
parents.
problem than field trips, so we were just looking at a historical context of how we got to have a conversation about field trips. And some of the other things that we brought up, like the sports and the funding for that transportation and the extracurricular field trip funding. Those are all historical conversations that we have had that tie into this particular issue. But that none of those have anything to do specifically with the budget. Those just have to do with what we've done historically in terms of.
Because we've done something historically, there's nothing.
Okay, so are you proposing that we just don't pay for field trips at all and that it's on every person's plate?
No, I'm saying at the high school, you have a different situation than you do in middle school and in elementary school where all the classes are participating.
Right.
And they're all going to the Zoom. But when we're talking about 20 students in one AP class or whatever it is,
For 40 students on the football team.
when we're talking about 20 students in one AP class,
Is the football team taking a field trip that I don't know about?
I'm just using that hypothetically. We have paid for like the field hockey overnights. We've paid, the school district has paid for
Yeah,
school
but that's
transportation.
that's out of Felty's budget. This is a different budget.
But the question is, are those funds allocated to that budget
Right.
for them to be going on district?
Yeah, but this
funded
is, we're
overnight
talking
trips?
about policy 121. None of that has anything to do with 121. Are you suggesting that you would be okay with the district taking care of elementary and middle school?
Absolutely, because we're taking care of all.
Can we all agree,
classes.
can we all agree to at least that part? Would anyone disagree with that part?
Maybe we want to get the number before we.
Yeah,
down
before
to
we
the
get my
facts.
concern is what is that?
That though, so here's the opposite end of that. So we'll work with Mr. Weaver and Mrs. Hurd. We'll bring back to you the total number.
We don't
we're
have the
to
number
pay.
here.
Well, that's the number I asked for 20 minutes ago. I said, how much is it that we pay every year over a year?
Yeah.
I know we have it. Mr. Weaver and Mrs. Hurd have calculated it. I don't know that he has it at his fingertips tonight. The other idea would be that students pay the same price for the same trip in different schools. And we never allow a student, yeah, it seems so logical, we never allow a student to go without a trip. Our counselors step up, we can be more overt about that, as Mrs. Evans Bracken has mentioned. But that would be another approach to consider. We sort of continue to do things the way we've been doing them, but we bring consistency to each building. I just learned some things about a fifth grade field trip, and I think there are areas where we have some inroads to have conversations like that. That's another option that we can consider. What we can do is bring back the total number, total cost, what would it be projected for K through 8 if we paid for that one curricular aligned field trip? And then we can consider that consistency. Each student, no matter where I attend school, pays the same for Perkins Pines as a fifth grader, or whatever it may be.
I like that. For sure.
Ms. Smith?
I think we just have to be careful that we recognize the trips have changed from year to year.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do have, this year we've gone to 1 in K to 5, so we picked 1. So the numbers that, we'll have to work together on what we're projecting versus what the numbers have been in the past might be slightly different there, but we can work that out. and bring something back.
Pre-pandemic, those numbers were much different.
Right,
Right.
that's a good point. Yes, and we were taking, I think, 2 trips at the elementary level per grade. We're not doing that
What's your
anymore.
plan next year?
1 trip per grade, yeah.
So can I ask, is that for budgetary reasons or curricular reasons that you put, I mean, I realize the pandemic, again, was a big disruptor, but would you want to go,
Yeah, like why was the
Why did
decision
we
made to
put
go
two
down to
to
1
one?
trip from the 2 trips?
I would say, and I don't want to speak for the principals, but that it was a combination of multiple things. I think, through the pandemic, certainly we pulled back on what those trips were. We also value the in-person, face-to-face time with our teachers and instructing our students. So they were looking for more of a balance of that. We've also had some difficulty with buildings agreeing upon what maybe each trip should be. So agreeing upon 1, it seemed to be moving forward a little bit better in terms of 2 maybe different trips that buildings wanted to do. So I think they felt like this was a nice compromise, and planning a field trip and orchestrating that is quite a bit. And so I think, 1 seemed to be a place that everybody was agreeable, teachers as well as the principals. It was a good experience, but also valued our time that we had with students.
I would anticipate too, based on some recent conversation, what's been happening, buses are a challenge
are.
for our second field trip this year. Right now, we're working with our bus company to try and avoid having to leave at 9 o'clock and be back by 2:15. That's hard to do when our kids are going into Philadelphia. However, they would love that if we could accommodate. That really can limit the time. We were talking about the 7th grade going to Camden Aquarium. That limits their experience. So busing is also, I'm guessing, something we have to think about.
Ms. Smith? In what I've been getting from this in the beginning, your ask here was basically you're trying to get the opinion of the committee about what it is that we feel about the field trips, and a lot of this stuff has now gone to financial things. Obviously, we're not going to settle anything tonight. Did you get the information that you were looking for, so you could perhaps come up with any sort of a policy proposal, or is this something that you want us to look at as a group again in a more open way, or perhaps even a subcommittee to look at this. I think we can find areas of consensus here. Like I said, the elementary, I think, is probably the easiest thing to go to, possibly the middle, but I don't think we have enough information in this room to set a policy for the district on field trips at this point, because I think we would need to talk with principals, home and school association people, and find out where it is that we want this policy to go, because a policy is not supposed to be for this year and this budgetary cycle. It's supposed to be forward-looking. And I think once we can find out what it is the ask is that we want specifically for this field trips and what our value is on these field trips, that, you know, elementary school, it's going to be curriculum, or, you know, even fun things for elementary school. I don't think almost anybody here has a problem with the district paying for that 100% and not even having to need the checkbox, because the district will take care of that. And as we move up in grade level, that's when all these things become more sticking points. But I don't think it's something that we're going to settle here tonight, but I think it's a goal that we should be looking at. And I don't know if you have a timeline of what kind of policy you would want to go, you know, because obviously we have time at this point to implement a policy change to this before next school year. We have plenty of time to do this. Did you get what you needed in this meeting, and what is the next step you would like to take?
So I'm not even sure that a policy change is necessary. The policy is what
Possibly
the
not.
board, you know, the board should approve or not. I think it's the AR that needs some clarification, and then we would need to adjust our field trip form, because we currently ask them to put all the costs in, divided by the number of kids, so they figure out how much they're charging. So I think I have somewhat of a direction and some numbers that we need to maybe bring back. I would be looking for something to be clear for next year's trips. These year's trips are already out of the gate. Parents know what, you know, they got permission slips, they know what those costs are. I think we can bring back the overall cost for the last couple of years, what we're projecting it to be. And then if we can, before the start of next school year, have a better idea of what the district wants to fund, I think that would be a good timeline from my perspective.
Okay, good.
Mr. Weaver, could we also get, the amount that each of our schools is spending of their in-out budget for financial assistance per school, so we can see the difference?
Sure, we can look at that, absolutely.
Do we also know how much the home and schools are contributing to the trips? Do we have that number, or is that?
We do, because the home and school report their financial.
So I think that's, I mean, knowing that Shanksville, they pay for the transportation, that significantly decreases their costs per student. And even if we looked at, okay, everybody pays the same amount, that could become a hardship to the students in Shanksville. You know, if all of a sudden home school can't contribute to it and they have to pay $20, that's going to affect those families.
We can gather that information right now.
Yeah, so the next policy, well, obviously the next policy.
I think a lot of the stuff we're gonna get outside of what would be typically policy, because a particular field trip is gonna have different financial aspects to it that we need. And I think I tend to agree with Mrs. Smith on that either the ARs is the way to go on this. I think it's gonna be very hard to tailor a long-term policy towards every what-if financial situation across the district.
Anything else? Okay, school wellness?
Okay, so in the school wellness policy, I wanted to bring attention to the board. Some of the proposed changes recommended by the wellness committee. So we formed a subcommittee of the wellness committee and proposed some different revisions than what had been presented earlier in the year. So you'll see them in green. A couple of things to highlight. Where physical activity, including recess, shall not be used as a consequence is something that the subcommittee is recommending.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
So physical activity is encompassing gym, right? That's physical. Recess, because kids are going outside. Yeah. being on a basketball team would be considered a physical activity,
If it occurred during the school day.
not even after the school day, only during the school day?
It says consequence during the school day.
Yeah.
So, for instance, we wouldn't pull a kid from gym to have a conversation with them, or have a kid serve a detention or meet with the principal during a gym class. We would pull them from English instead.
No, we occasionally pull them from phys ed. It's a logistical matter, but that's not the consequence, that's the discussion. So, if they were in a day of suspension, they would miss their phys ed on the day that they were suspended. Detentions are outside of the school day.
What's the onus on not pulling and including recess as a consequence during the school day?
I think at the elementary level, teachers have been known to say, you didn't finish this, you have to stay in for recess. I think, I don't know, I didn't sit on that, but I think that's where it's coming
That was
from.
the thought of the committee when I did serve on that subcommittee, so I have a little insight on what the thinking was there. Yes, the idea was basically, you can't have an elementary teacher say you've been just either to the entire class or to an individual, that you've been disruptive today and therefore no recess. You're gonna return to the class, you're gonna sit down, read a book, or physical activity is considered an important part of the student's day, and the recess is a part of the wellness of the whole individual student. The policy before didn't address that as clearly. And so that was our thinking when we wrote it in that way, that because recess is considered it's as valuable to the student's learning to have that break and that physical activity than as it is to be in the classroom. And therefore, we want to make it clear that your recess cannot be touched. In a similar way, physical education is a class at that point. We're not, unless it was something that was happening actually in the physical education class, that's not going to be used as a punishment either. We can get creative about other ways to do things.
And I think that I would offer just in addition that it is the belief that students having physical activity, getting to go out for recess, participating in phys ed can actually help offset some behaviors. So I'm very much in favor of maintaining recess for students during the day and finding other ways to modify their behaviors when needed, other consequences.
Then why are we deleting the line that says 2 or more hours of inactivity is discouraged if we're so having a thought process on how important it is that physical activity?
The thought behind that, and
I was there, I was at the meetings,
not for the subcommittees.
I was at some of them when they talked about this,
Okay,
Where are you, Mr. Saylor? I'm sorry.
right above physical activity, including recess shall not be used or withheld as a form of punishment, consequence during the school day. Right above that, there was the deletion of extended periods of student inactivity, 2 or more hours shall be discouraged.
Mr. Leggett, I'm curious.
yes,
Yeah,
the
there's a
thought,
lot of cuts here.
the thought behind that was basically looking at the school day and at how we act, our actual practices as we're there. We couldn't justify the fact that 2 hours was actually done of activity during the day. In order to have come up with that 2 hours, we probably almost would have to restructure the school day. So we're trying to bring the policy more in alignment with the actual schedules that the students have. Am I speaking out of turn there?
No,
No, but you're suggesting, the way you just explained that, it sounded like we were trying to achieve 2 hours of physical activity, and what it says is extended periods of student inactivity of 2 hours or more. We just heard.
I think this one was based upon the fact that we felt that schedules in and of themselves in all of the buildings don't permit 2 hours of inactivity. For example, in your secondary schedules, every 45 minutes, 50 minutes, they're up and moving to the next class. Elementary schedules have those frequent breaks are built in. So if I recollect, the committee didn't feel it was necessary to have that there because it's innately built into the schedule that students are moving.
Basically redundant.
And then, so why would we take out physical activity breaks shall be provided for elementary students during classroom hours?
Because again, that ties into what Lori just said about it's built into the structure of the schedule for the classroom day.
We're, and I didn't read the full thing, but is that supposed to imply like brain breaks? That's what
Yeah,
they
they
were
get up
called.
and
Okay, my
run.
kids are older, but that's what they were called, were brain breaks, where the teachers would take time to do just a little break to get as they used to tell the kids, get the wiggles out, you know, do things like that. I mean, I think those were important to the kids, especially, you know, the younger they are moving.
So because it's best practice for that to be the case in classroom management. Nobody feels like it needs to be codified in the policy.
Subcommittee didn't,
Yeah, and
I mean, I'm agreeing with that. I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
If it's best practice. I mean, the reason that it would be in the policy is because if somebody wasn't
We need to
adhering
push.
to it.
right,
Right.
But is that, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate on this. Is that gonna lead to some teacher deciding that it's not in the policy, so therefore I don't have to do it?
Would
Just
you-
because most of the teachers do these things.
Right.
I think it's dangerous to say, oh, well, they'll automatically do that. And making that assumption. I think that,
It's strange, though, that you would also then make the assumption that as an elementary school teacher plans their day, they're going and reading the wellness policy to make sure they do what they.
well, well, the thing is in theory, they should know what's in.
Right. I think
That it's part of
culturally,
their
I would
jobs.
like to say that our buildings have a high confidence that there's probably more than adequate brain breaks available.
Yeah, but I think again, you're talking about the policy of districts. Me, to know that the district has a policy that we don't go for more than 2 hours without.
But that would.
Or that there's
comfort
even just
somebody.
even saying that they need to be built in, you know, I mean, there was one that was taken out. I'm sorry, Dr. Russell was up further,
okay.
that basically just kind of said,
I think it's page 4. Oh, you're not on the people.
it basically just said that there'll be breaks built into at elementary level for class, during classroom time. It's very generic. Oh, there it is. Physical activity breaks shall be provided for elementary students during classroom hours. It's kind of generic, but it still puts the emphasis in there, and if that is best practice and that is what we should be doing, why take it out of the policy? I mean, it's one thing if you say the 2 hour, you know, being specific with time for 2 hours because it's not physically possible for that to happen with the break schedule, but it is. But when you're talking about things like brain breaks, which does go to each teacher's personal, how they're running their classroom. Putting it in there allows that to be more, you know, more codified in the policy. I mean, I think that's
Not
where.
taking recess from a kid has been best policy for years.
Well,
Doesn't mean that our teachers.
That's a consequence. You're not gonna listen, nobody's going outside.
We're
We're all coming back
But
after lunch. Like,
all the research shows that that is not a best practice. So
Right.
that is.
So you're saying that it should stay in there?
I think it should stay.
Like, so. I wanna get back to this, is physical activity gym? Cause that's during the school day, is gym physical activity?
They get credit for it.
So if a student is, let's say they're playing dodgeball, the student is being bad during dodgeball. We're no longer allowed to tell them they have to sit out and not play.
What would constitute withheld? The whole period, 5 minutes, your team rotates out and not withholding, you just hit someone in the head, sit down for 5 minutes, is that withholding? I don't know if that happens often in PE class.
I think the spirit of the policy is to make sure we're incorporating physical activity, and it comes in different forms in each of our schools for our students. I mean, I absolutely support keeping this comment in here if the committee believes it is more overt and made clear to our teachers, this is who we are and this is how we'd like to see our schools run for the benefit of our students.
I don't see how if you don't take away recess in the younger students, and data has shown that because we don't take away things like recess, student behavior across not just the Commonwealth, but the Republic is abhorrent. if we don't start taking away things that they like and calling it punishment and not consequence, that we're never gonna be able to realign or refocus our youngest generation.
I think there's modified things you can do. I know at Skip Act, a standard practice that was done when my kids were there years ago was if a kid, and it usually happened during recess, but if a kid was misbehaving at recess, they were told to walk the track. So they were still getting physical activity, but it was, you're walking the track. You don't get to go play on the jungle gym. You don't get to go play on the, the equipment. You walk the track. And I think that that's a way, so you can't say you have to sit at a desk for the 20 minutes or half an hour that is recess. But, okay, at recess today, you're gonna walk the track.
But now the policy says you can't use that as a consequence.
No, it says you can't
Use that as a
withhold
consequence.
physical activity, but they're still out at recess and
I'll
they're
read
still
the
doing
draft.
something.
It says physical activity shall not be used
It was there
as
before
a
though.
consequence.
The old policy was physical activity shall not be used or withheld as a form of punishment.
But it was.
The way
done.
our policy was written is you couldn't take recess away then either. Because if physical activity shall not be used or withheld as a form of punishment,
But it-
teachers weren't allowed to do that either. They
But
were
it-
going against policy if they were doing
Right,
that.
but it was in practice done.
Now, hold on one second. You have a Zoom thing.
Ms. Coburn, you can unmute and talk.
Great. So I just want to point out that at the elementary schools right now, there are still teachers who are taking away recess for bad behavior. They're also taking it away if an agenda book wasn't signed by a parent or if homework wasn't completed. That's not okay when you take away movement breaks for children, especially children who have behavioral problems. You actually make the behavioral problem worse because they can't get the energy out to start to focus and listen.
Thank you.
I think that's an interesting point too, because there are certain, like, where's the line of what you're taking it away for? I mean, you're taking it away because the kid, hit another kid, that's one thing, but really it should be more than recess at that point. You're taking it away because an agenda book wasn't signed or homework wasn't finished, that seems punitive. That's not helpful, that's not gonna,
Well, to your comment, an English teacher, elementary school teacher doesn't study the policy manual, but it needs to be presented to them what policy
what
is
policy
allowed.
is, right, exactly. I do think that, all the policies, the teachers need to be aware of it. And when it's in the policy, it also gives parents a chance to go back and say, hey, you can't do this if they aren't aware of it.
So recess should not be used as a consequence.
So I'm gonna get back to Rowan's comment. Having a kid walk a track is not allowable
Under the policy.
under the policy. Because that's considered a hazing and it says physical activity.
Hazing, I wouldn't call
Well,
it hazing.
I don't call it hazing either, but physical activity can't be used as a form of consequence.
Right.
Used or withheld.
Yeah,
Can't be used or withheld.
It's
So a
used
teacher,
in there, that
so
would
a,
make it,
so a
yeah.
teacher saying to a kid, hey, you're being bad, go walk up and down the steps. Instead of playing dodgeball, go walk up and down the steps or go walk the track, that can't be, that's not allowed either.
Can't make them, right, can't tell them to do physical activity.
Yeah.
Punishment.
Correct.
Wow, we've just been violating. this
And you
policy.
also, I think, Jason, you also outlined a potential unintended consequence that if this is adopted as written, then would a teacher not have the ability to pull a student who's actually having a behavioral issue during that physical activity, could they not stop them from continuing that physical activity? I would think the answer is probably no. The teacher does still have that ability there.
I think everybody agrees on the nature of where we wanna go, it's just the way it's, the overall, well, the idea of it, that you want kids to not be punished for not having an agenda book signed,
Yeah.
but not, you know what I mean, there's a line. It's just, there's no good way to, it's the wording of it that is leaving it too open to misinterpretation.
And we're including recess though, also, is the proposal.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
that there's a lot, like I said, like, nobody wants their kid to be held in from recess for not having an agenda book signed, but if a kid does have a meltdown, they may need to go to the counseling office. Or they may need to go and talk to the principal, or they may need to go somewhere else.
So that's where I.
And that
felt
happens
the
during
unintended
recess.
Consequences, that there's gotta be something else written here that under certain circumstances, they might have to go to the office, for example.
Yeah, I mean, there may be more to it than, so how do you word that though, that it covers it?
Right.
So it's
How do you
written-
word it that it,
And we took out the line that we're gonna train the staff about the wellness. We probably shouldn't take that line out based on what we just heard. We should bold that and underline it.
Well,
one of the-
Make that clear.
There should be training that goes beyond that.
Yeah,
So when you have a special education child and they do need the recess, that the teachers are aware of what needs to be done and they're very cognizant that they don't hold back certain things that go on. That's really important.
Yeah, I mean, well, because when you look at kids like with ADHD, getting out that movement is exactly what they need. I mean, that's a perfect example.
The
Of a-
sentence is repeated again later, but it adds a word in there that I think makes a difference. It says physical activity including recess shall not be used or withheld solely as a consequence during the school day. I think adding that solely,
Keeping it back in there.
it's in there later in the policy.
Yeah.
That same line is written again, but in there it has solely as a consequence during the
Yeah.
school day.
And, okay, and we did strike that to be consistent the other way, but are you suggesting?
no. Correct, it's not consistent. One has the word solely, one is not.
You're right, that one does.
You gotta run laps and recite your multiplication tables.
But I think that putting the word solely in there helps, go with the spirit of what this is doing. But it does allow us, if we need to talk to a kid during gym class, that we can.
Well, and Mr. Marsh you made a good point about what withheld means. You did, it was. About what withheld means, you know, like what is withheld? Is withheld 5 minutes, is withheld an hour, you know, what are we? You know, it's subjective as to what. The consequence should be, but.
And it might be appropriate for someone to play alone, bounce a ball against a wall.
Right, they need quiet, they
If
need to
they
be
were
separated,
not-
right, redirected, right.
They were not playing well with others during the day.
Absolutely agree.
That's an example where teachers need some autonomy to some degree to make the decision.
But part of that is recognition and training. And what we heard is different teachers are doing different things that are against the current policy.
Just going back to Sarah's comment, Ms. Evans Brockman's comment, right? I'm sorry about that. So that physical activity, including recess, shall not be used or withheld solely as consequence during the school day. That line's in there 3 times, but it should be that line each time. Because twice it doesn't have the word solely. So that. Ms. Evans Brockman, that's what you're, yeah, that line.
I think that solely makes a difference.
I think it was in the AR, right? The third one was in the AR.
No, it's actually 3 times in here too.
Oh.
Get updated. Update that. Anything else on school wellness? I mean, I would update Ms. Evans Brockett to point, update that line each 3 times.
Okay, so we'll take care of that. And then the only other thing I wanted to call out was under allergy management. We changed management of food allergies to allergy management. And that teachers and staff will not distribute food items without informing parents or guardians, first.
Aren't they supposed to check with the nurse first
The,
to avoid the situation?
I don't know that that was called out in policy, and it was something that the group talked about.
Yeah.
Prompted by a situation that occurred. And the nurse on our committee recommended that before anyone would distribute food to students, parents should be made aware.
That's when teachers and staff distribute food.
Right,
So was that an allergen issue? Because I think in here it says the nutritional content. So
Both.
are we telling you carbs and protein and fats and like what
Sugars.
sugars?
yeah,
They just
so
focus on sugars.
I think that was, Mrs. Lewis was on our subcommittee, I think that was her concern, that if a
With all the
student is
sugar.
diabetic, we also need to know the
Oh.
carb 10.
Okay,
So besides allergies, dairy, for
so it
example.
really is, here's the nutritional label of the food I'm gonna be handing out.
Right.
Okay,
But to the last, on the last page, it says teachers and staff will not distribute food items to students without informing parents, guardians. Shouldn't it also be nurse as well? Shouldn't they, if they're gonna distribute food, shouldn't they be checking with the nurse? This is the class that I'm gonna be distributing the food, what issues might be in that class?
I think that would be an extra layer of protection of safety.
Because, let's say you have a kid that has a gluten allergy,
Mhm.
that's airborne for some people. So it would be important for that medical person to be involved in what might be happening in that classroom. Because you do have some of these allergies are airborne.
Right.
That's why, like, we gotta sit at non-clinical, whatever it's called.
Those conversations are typically had at the start of the school year.
Yeah.
So if our school nurses are aware of allergies, there's conversations with teachers so that information is communicated, because typically if it's an allergy that's severe enough to warrant some sort of a plan, like a healthcare plan, then we have to ensure that across the educational environment, everyone's aware.
It's good to reinforce in the policy where we talk about the teachers getting food from the student too.
and this is really nitpicky, but I thought that we had switched from the term guardian to like adult of record or something of that nature. Did that happen? I remember that in some other policy, we weren't saying parent or guardian, we were saying parent or adult with legal record or something like that.
You know what? I'll have to look back at that. I don't think we're being consistent with that.
Yeah,
So maybe
I
I'll look
just
into
like-
that.
And I think
Yeah.
it's nitpicky, but just
Yeah.
if we were adopting that terminology for a
Right.
reason, then
That makes sense.
integrated throughout. Yeah.
Do we want to remove the phrase used connected to recess? Physical activity shall not be used.
Well, I mean, I have heard of examples of, oh, you're like a class do 10 push-ups or something like that.
What did you
happening.
say?
You're like a class do 10 push-ups.
Really? You think it should stay?
I mean, if you have the line in there at all, you might as well cover all the ground. That's all I.
There's just goofy stuff.
I mean, if, because any
Keep it.
Was it like
professional would
1987?
not do any of this anyway.
I'm telling you.
But you legislate these common numbers.
And yet, can I just point out that as a parent volunteer at entertainment night at Skipback, all those kids wanted to do was push-ups.
That's right. They want to-
And all I did was walk around and I was like, says they would be the ones, and they don't be like, just do 10 push-ups.
We started every day in fifth grade.
But it wasn't a
Yeah, I think it's the thing there is that it's
She was a drill
it's
sergeant.
the punishment aspect of it.
Anything else in 246?
Dr. Russell, I just think we may need to talk with our nurses about that piece, adding about checking with the nurses. Because it would also be possible that, I mean, we would think that our nurses would be aware of students' food allergies, but there could be circumstances where they're not. So I think we also need to engage in that conversation with the nurses, just in the Nurse Practices Act as well, and that obligation, so that we're not putting a responsibility on our nurses that should not reside with them as well, just on that flip side.
And so we unstrike the sentence of physical activity for we provided for elementary students for classroom.
I think we did, and you're proposing to unstrike that?
Yeah, but the committee had suggested striking that.
What about the part about it?
This is like a motion with context, so that, you know. Okay, for that being struck, but that doesn't lie to me, because there are certain people who just don't do anything.
So right here, Mrs. Unstrucken, the statement. Everybody okay with that? We unstrike this?
That was the one that I had thought. It should be common knowledge, it should be, but it is something that we want. We want them to do break breaks and things like that with the kids in elementary, so. That was practice.
You okay with that?
It's great. Doing each class? We're doing freshman hours.
I think it is vague.
It doesn't, I mean, strike it, unstrike it, doesn't say anything. I think what Ms. Evans Brockett wants is teachers give physical activity brain breaks. Ms. Evans, are you talking about every class, right? Each,
This is elementary students, so they're with the same teacher all day.
correct, but they separate their class. They have like, you know, we're gonna, the next 45 minutes is gonna be English, and the next 45 minutes is social studies.
I'm not saying that we need to get that specific into teachers, because I think what a first grade teacher needs to do versus a fifth grade teacher is different, but I think that we just need it through the policy of our district that elementary students should have physical activity breaks, because they're not like our middle school and high school students switching periods every 5 minutes.
And the guidance already existed, so just
Correct.
leave it in.
Yeah.
So that we don't have teachers construe that we've changed the guidance such that they don't need to provide physical activity.
I have a feeling that it was struck in the trying to eliminate redundancies across a lot of different places, department. And to tell you the truth, it doesn't hurt anything, we just leave it there. You know, sometimes there's nothing wrong with having a redundancy when it reinforces some of what you want, even if it doesn't really say.
I'll have Ms. Widener put that back in. I'm having difficulties.
ARs?
So I just wanted the committee to know that administration is working diligently to update the administrative regulations and make them public. So as the policy committee recommends policies to go to first reading, we've been working on the ARs as they move through that approval process. And the ARs are designed to really help people to know in more layman's terms how to uphold the policy, what's expected. Sometimes it's a form. If there's a case of discrimination, if you will, or a student complaint, there's a form that's attached. In the case of field trips, we can attach the field trip form. So an administrative reg comes in different forms, if you will, not to overuse the word, but I just wanted the policy committee to know we're working on making sure that as we move through the approval process, we're providing appropriate administrative regs to assist individuals in realizing how to uphold policy, what forms they might want to reference as we move through, okay?
Any questions? Questions from the audience? Or excuse me, comments from the audience? Anyone on Zoom? Okay, 5.02 is the policy committee minutes, 5.03 are the upcoming meeting dates, 5.04 is our notice of recording disclaimer, and without objection, I will rule adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Second board. Chair Long.
Yeah, see you. Thank you.
Yes.